Good morning again. With the snow outside, it can bring up some interesting responses in people, maybe even some competitiveness, because I want to know how many of you think that you're a really good driver, particularly in the snow. Yep, the male hubris shows up as expected. That's about right. I consider myself a pretty good driver, but I've had some close calls, and you've probably had some close calls on the road. A non-snow story, but still a close call. Jen and I were dating. I lived and worked in Connecticut. She was in New York. It was about an hour apart, so we would drive back and forth. And one day we were driving together from Connecticut to New York. We were getting on the highway. We were heading towards the Tappan Zee Bridge. At that time, it was called the Tappan Zee Bridge. And, I was cool, being cool boyfriend guy, one hand on the wheel, one arm around her, or at least the seat. And when you get onto the highway, it was a pretty sharp curve. And being cool guy, boyfriend guy, and I'm just kind of taking this curve, and I've taken like hundreds of times, and I was going a little too fast, so I took the curve a little too hard, and I knew I was in trouble, because out of my mouth came, "Oh God, help!" It came out of my mouth, because we were going this way, and of course there's then the overcorrection. And I did a full 360 on the highway and ended up completely parallel, about 3 inches away from the guardrail, at a complete stop. And that was really scary. And that was a close call. That's my driving story. I think I'm a good driver. How many of you think you're good swimmers with the precipitation outside? Good swimmers? Good swimmers. I think I'm a pretty good swimmer, but there's also been close calls with that. I was my first sort of road trip as an adult. Me and a buddy went down to North Carolina to see a friend. We then picked him up, drove a little ways longer to the Outer Banks. We wanted to go swimming in the Outer Banks. I'd never seen the Outer Banks before. He had a Mustang. We could drive really fast down the really long road in the Outer Banks. So we get to the beach, and there's nobody there. There's no houses. There's no lifeguards. There's no anything. And I like to swim, and I see the water, and I hit the water head on, and I leave my buddies behind. And before I know it, I'm like way far out there. But that's no big deal, because the sand was underneath me for most of the whole time. And I was out there pretty far, and I was getting tired, and it was time to turn back. So I turned back, and I swim a little ways, and I go to put my feet down, and there's nothing under my feet anymore. And I look up to see where my buddies were, and I was about 300 yards away from them to the side. And I said, And the waves were getting pretty heavy, and I was wearing contact lenses. I was getting splashed in the eyes, so then I was sort of blinded and tired. And I couldn't really yell for them because I was so far away. And I thought, okay, I'm in trouble. I thought I might die. So I swam, and I swam, and I swam, and I swam, and I made it back to shore. I see them kind of going out as I'm coming in. And then I reach the shore. I could barely see. I can barely breathe. But I see them kind of out there, and I'm like, they're going to get swept just the same way I am in this little rip current. I want to call out, but I'm so tired and I'm so blind. I'm like, if I can make it, they'll make it. And I collapsed there on the beach. Close calls. You've probably had some close calls. The beautiful thing about talking about close calls in this room is we know we've all made it through a couple of these because we're still here. The hard part is that we know there's been close calls where friends, family, loved ones haven't made it through. They could have been accidents or crisis things or disease or addiction, and that's a struggle. So our text today is the end of chapter 4 in the book of Mark, and we're going to observe a close call. and see what Jesus does and see how people respond to Jesus. We begin in chapter 4 in verse 35. This is after Jesus had been done teaching. He just told a bunch of parables. Verse 35 begins with this. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side of the lake." They were on a big lake. Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was. He was probably already in the boat. And they went. And here's an interesting little detail that I think is really important. It's important because it sort of gives some credibility to the fact that there was other people around reporting this story, that the Gospels are like they're true accounts, because this is like a little detail that wouldn't be just in a generic account. But it's an important detail that'll come up later. There were also other boats with him. It just wasn't Jesus and his buddies in a boat in a lake. There was other boats out there too. Then a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. In this part of the Middle East, this particular lake was known for high winds and big waves. So this was not out of the ordinary at all. Not out of the ordinary to experience stormy waters, either specifically, like out on the water, or just in life. Stormy waters show up all the time. But these people in this boat had a particular relationship with the water and with the sea. The sea can be scary. Here's one of the most well-known depictions of the sea, known as the Great Wave or the Wave. It's a woodblock print by a Japanese artist named, I believe, Hokusai. You see this around and it gets reprinted a lot, but what you sort of forget to notice is that there's 3 boats in this picture. We notice the details and sort of the peak of this wave, but there's 3 boats that are in trouble there. And people tend to believe that this is a depiction of a rogue wave that can come out of nowhere and cause a lot of damage. The ancient people, the Israelites, had a really interesting relationship with the sea. In their mind, in their stories, how they understood themselves as having a tense relationship with the sea. Here's some perspective from some scholars. They say that as part of creation, the sea was under the control of Yahweh, our God. But it was also a consistent threat, pushing against the shores, which held back its potentially violent force. The sea, with its roaring and churning, had a dangerous power, so much greater than that of mankind, that the Hebrews sometimes used marine imagery to speak of their enemies' attacks, which they felt helpless to withstand without divine intervention. The Hebrews, the Israelites, they were not seafaring people. Other than going fishing, they didn't have much to do with the seas or the lakes. The ancient Phoenicians are kind of known as the sea people, but not the Israelites. They sort of respected the power of the sea. There's some scripture that kind of brings this to bear in our minds. Back to Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. We talked about this months and months ago, this sense of mystery and anticipation that before creation even existed, there was something going on, and it was odd and mysterious and full of tension. In the very, very, very beginning, there's this relationship with the waters. And then we move on to some of the Psalms. Psalm 103, the writer says, Some went out on the sea in ships. They were merchants on the mighty waters. They saw the works of the Lord, his wonderful deeds in the deep. For he spoke and stirred up a tempest that lifted high the waves. They mounted up to the heavens and went down to the depths. In their peril, their courage, these sailors, their courage melted away. They reeled and staggered like drunkards. They were at their wits' end. The sea is scary. Psalm 69. Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in the fiery depths where there is no foothold. That's the story I just told. There was no foothold. I have come into the deep waters. The floods engulf me. I am worn out calling for help. My throat is parched. My eyes fail, looking for my God. Whatever this writer was going through, he compared it to drowning. Waters up to the neck. How am I going to overcome this? And then two more from the Hebrew Scriptures. Jonah says, you hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. And then from 2 Samuel, the waves of death swirled about me. The torrents of destruction overwhelmed me. The cords of the grave coiled around me. The snares of death confronted me. If you were an ancient Hebrew and you wanted to describe the hardest thing that you're going through, the biggest struggle that you have, the situation that seems impossible to overcome, even up to the point of death, you would probably describe it in terms of the waters, the seas, darkness, waves being pulled under, water coming up too high. That's how the biblical writers wanted to talk about the hardest times of their lives. Because it's a metaphor that's almost universal. Everybody experiences stormy waters. Everybody. Nobody gets away unscathed in this life. So now back to our story. There's a storm. A furious squall came up. The waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. And maybe the disciples on the boat are recalling all of this biblical imagery. Like, yeah, this is what we're always talking about. This is why we don't like to go on the water. Our ancestors kept telling us this, but did we listen? No, we had to go across the lake. Maybe that was in their mind. Maybe it wasn't, and they're just trying to survive. But then this strange Jesus. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" I have tension with this story because I know how Jesus responds, and I'm not comfortable with it. I think this is a good question. I really, really do. I think it's a good spiritual question. I think it's a good question for those who are seeking or who have lost something of faith and maybe are trying to claw their way back. And they said, God, it's not really been working for me. Do you care? I've had stormy waters. I've had loss. I've made mistakes. Do you care, God? Do you care, Jesus? Don't you care if I drown? Don't you care if I die? Don't you care if I can't claw my way out of this hole that I've dug for myself? Don't you care? A good question. For Jesus, it seems to not be the right question. And that brings me tension. But what I do find comfort is they ask this question and Jesus doesn't answer the question, but he does act. We ask a question, and Jesus acts. He got up, verse 39, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. I've been doing a lot of quiet, be still lately. Not because I'm spiritually mature or disciplined or anything. It's because my daughter loves to read Where the Wild Things Are. And after the wild rumpus and the monsters are sort of confronting Max, he says, "Be still!" And they stop. Jesus confronts the forces of nature and says, "Quiet, be still." And they stop. Then I hate this next part. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid?" It's not so bad. Do you still have no faith? What? Jesus, where are you coming from? You were asleep. We asked if you cared. You didn't answer our question. But you did something. You didn't do nothing. And maybe that's where we have to hang our hat for a second. Jesus doesn't respond the way we were wanting or expecting to, but he does respond, but then he rebukes us, the disciples. And this causes tension for me. But here's the stuff I think I know by now. Everyone experiences stormy waters, literally or metaphorically. You're not going to get answers. I mean, many times you're not going to get answers. Sometimes Jesus doesn't want to answer or explain himself. We're so rationalistic that in our suffering, in our stormy waters, we tend to go right away with why. In our grief, in our sadness, we go to why really, really fast. Like as though if God laid out this thing, well, that happened, so this could happen, so this could happen, so this could happen, so this could happen. So really, you're just you're a cog of this machine, like it would bring some comfort to us. We're Western rationalistic creatures. We go to why. And Jesus doesn't really do that, but what it does come down to is whether Jesus is on that boat with you. Because you're going to have stormy water. And you might not get answers to the why questions. You might not get encouraging feedback. But either Jesus is on that boat with you, or you're navigating those stormy waters by yourself. And that's not a fun place to be. Now it would be easy to sort of go off into this tangent about like what this looks like and how to have faith when things are at its hardest. I honestly don't think I've lived long enough to speak into that. I mean, I've had losses, I've shared some, I've had stormy waters. I can't tell if I've navigated them well or not, and if Jesus was on that proverbial boat with me or not, or if I gave him access or if I didn't during the hardest times of my life. I don't know, but I can learn from example. I can learn from example of people who don't too quickly go, "Why, God? Just explain yourself." Or too quickly over-spiritualize and sentimentalize something and say, well, if that didn't happen, then, well, I don't know what else could have been. It's just a mystery. I don't know, but I have to just have faith in this kind of cheap way. I think those are two temptations of where we can go in stormy waters, demanding something of God or just writing it off and over-spiritualizing it. And then a couple months ago, I saw an example in the real world, and I'm gonna share this with you. It sort of went viral. You might have come across this yourself. In early December in Texas, there was a police officer that responded to a disturbance in front of a supermarket. And during that disturbance, the officer named Richard Houston was fatally shot. And he was killed. The shooter survived. But a week later, there was a service at a church there in Texas, and Officer Houston's daughter eulogized him. Her name's Shelby. She's 18 years old, going through stormy waters. And I'll say more after. We're going to watch about a 6-minute segment of this. 18-year-old young woman eulogizing her father. So, let's watch.
I keep waiting for him to pull up in the driveway to come inside and tell us about some crazy car chase he got into, or maybe even how terrible the 7-Eleven taquitos were for lunch.
It's time to leave CenturyLink's outdated internet behind and get the latest technology from Optimum. Now delivering fast internet up to 1 gig. That's up to 100 times fast.
You never knew. It was always a surprise what he had gotten into that day. However, there was no heavier surprise than to receive a call that your dad had been shot and killed. It will be a day I never forget. I remember having conversations with my dad about him losing friends and officers in the line of duty. I have heard all the stories you can think of, but I've always had such a hard time with how the suspect is dealt with. Not that I didn't think there should be justice served, but my heart always ached for those who don't know Jesus. Their actions being a reflection of that. I was always told that I would feel differently if it happened to me, but as it's happened to my own father, I think I still feel the same. There has been anger, sadness, grief, and confusion, and part of me wishes I could despise the man who did this to my father, but I can't get any part of my heart to hate him. All that I can find is myself hoping and praying for this man to truly know Jesus. I thought this might change if the man continued to live, but when I heard the news that he was in stable condition, part of me was relieved. My prayer is that someday down the road, I'd get to spend some time with the man who shot my father. Not to scream at him, not to yell at him, not to scold him, simply to tell him about Jesus. I've spent the past few days thinking about what it was like for my daddy to lay lifeless in the flesh, but full of life with our Father in heaven. I wonder what it was like to reunite with his father, to see his other officers who fell in the line of duty, but mostly to sit at the right hand of Jesus. I can imagine it's a much better place than here. There are plenty of stories of his time spent as an officer, but there was another side of him that I had the privilege of knowing as my dad. He was goofy, incredibly too sarcastic. There was always a joke up his sleeve. There was never a volleyball, baseball, or football game he was going to miss. Never a band competition he'd miss either. Not for me or my siblings. He was our biggest fan on and off the court and field. He encouraged me, pushed me, and supported every decision I made. There were many days whenever I was a baby, like Doug said, he'd take me to the shooting range to train with other officers, and a few of them, like Doug, would watch me while he went to qualify. I'll never forget when I was younger, he would drop anything for me. Quite literally, on one of those days, he'd physically drop me as he got me out of the car. I'll never let him live that down, and he sobbed like a baby when he did. All jokes aside, he really has dropped anything and everything for us. If I wanted to dress up as Dorothy from Wizard of Oz for my 4th birthday, I wasn't doing it alone. He'd put all the face makeup on, make the costume, just to dress up as the scarecrow alongside me. That's always been his heart, and we would always be the highest priority. I'm resting in the obedience of my dad to the Lord. In Isaiah 6:8 it says, "Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, 'Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?' And I said, 'Here I am. Send me.'" And I don't ever think my father knew that his yes to the Lord would ever end up being like this. But as I look out to you all today, this is just a picture of the faithfulness of Jesus. I know my dad is looking down today with the biggest smile on his face in the arms of Jesus. I know as he entered the gates of heaven, he was greeted with, "Well done, good and faithful servant." What a moment that was. The days, weeks, months, and years ahead will surely be hard, but at the same time so sweet, knowing I'm 1 second, 1 minute, 1 hour closer to being with him again. There was still a lot of life I was looking forward to spending with him. 18 years with you, Daddy, was just not enough time. You were faithful, steadfast, kind, loving, selfless, and hardworking. On December 3rd, you were silenced, but you will forever live on in my heart today and all the days to come. I'd do anything in the world to see you again, to laugh with you again, to watch your terrible dance moves, to listen to another joke, to practice volleyball with you, to watch birds with you again, to catch one more fish, to wrestle one more time, to hug you again, to hear your voice at last. In my deepest wound, I saw the glory of Jesus, and it has astounded me. You're my hero, Daddy, and I'm so proud to call you my father. I love you most, and I'll see you someday soon.
A couple beats to compose ourselves. I think that's Jesus on the boat. At 18 years old. It was not sentimental or over spiritual. It was anchored in the truth of Jesus. It wasn't dismissive. These dismissive ideas of, oh, God has a bigger plan, so that had to happen. No. Murder is evil, and it didn't have to happen. The stormy waters. But that's, I think, what Jesus on the boat in the storm of our lives can look like. I think. In my deepest wound, I saw the glory of Jesus, and I was astounded. He said, back to the boat. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." I want to dumb this down. I want to tame Jesus here. I want him to be softer and more compassionate. But we can't do that because Jesus is asserting his authority. Quick recap of Jesus and his authority so far in this book. In these 4 chapters, through incidents of conflict, there's so much conflict so far in the book of Mark, Jesus has demonstrated his authority over the spiritual world, casting out demons, that kind of thing. the world of people. People kept trying to trap him and trick him, and he kept not letting that happen. And now the natural world, which can't be explained sometimes. Rogue waves and earthquakes and devastation. Jesus exercises authority over it. And when Jesus exercises authority, it is for the blessing of those who give him access to their lives. People have been healed. People have been set free from dark powers. People's lives were saved. And just when I want to really get on a roll here, I remember that detail from earlier in the story that I highlighted. There were other boats with him. Remember? There were other boats on that lake. That same storm came up. Those same people had to navigate that storm. Jesus was only on one of those boats. We don't know how those other boats fared. Whether they just had a close call, like the disciples, or whether they were destroyed. And I think that's intentional. Because we can't make sense of other people's stories and other people's lives. We can't rationalize our way and unravel why something bad happened to somebody else, but not to us. All we can do is decide for ourselves. Jesus, are you on my boat? Are you going to see me through this thing? And even if I don't survive, are you going to cross the threshold with me as I enter into eternity? That is the hope. That is the good news. Not that we follow Jesus. Everything always works out because Jesus always tells the stormy waters in our lives, be still. It's that he's on our boat, he's our captain, and even if the waters don't still, he's going to walk with us through that water. He's going to get wet with us. He's going to get knocked around by our side as we're getting knocked around. And if the waves keep us under and we never resurface, Jesus will be next to us, crossing the threshold into eternity, and we will never be alone. That, I think, is what it means for Jesus to be on the boat with us. Access. The people who gave Jesus access, his disciples, had the benefit of Jesus being with them in the stormy waters. Jesus asserts his authority over the spiritual world, over our human experience, and over the natural world. All those texts earlier about the Israelites being scared and concerned and intimidated by the waters, Jesus, I know, if the disciples didn't have it in mind, Jesus had it in mind. Because Jesus says, yeah, I'm Yahweh in the flesh. What you've been worried about forever, I can make be still. It was a testimony that he was God come in the flesh. He was the capstone to the ancient stories of the scary seas. And only one can make them be still. And only one can walk us through the stormy waters, to whatever the other side looks like. So like the disciples in their questions, or like this young woman, Shelby, in her confidence, and wherever you are on that spectrum, between questions and confidence, I think the question is the same. Isn't it time to go all in with Jesus? Isn't it time to go all in with him specifically? Jesus, the specific one who tells the waves to be still. Jesus, the specific one that gets battered around with the disciples and brings them through it. Not something vague, not something atmospheric, it'll all work out. If I just kind of try harder to do the right thing, it'll all work out. That's not guaranteed. The only guarantee is if Jesus is on our boat, he will see us through. So isn't it time to go all in with Jesus? I'm going to close in prayer. The team's going to come up. I want to give you a moment in your seats just to respond. Eyes closed, just you and Jesus. And maybe it's the question you want to ask him. Jesus, what does all in look like? What does trust look like? What does you seeing me through look like? Can I hand over everything to you? Jesus, as we contemplate those questions, by your Spirit, would you give each one of us a clear picture of what all in looks like, of what being seen through the storm looks like, of what you being our anchor looks like, no matter how deep the pain or no matter how confusing the question. Jesus, would your voice and your image break through? And would you inspire in us new faith? Not faith that everything will just work out okay, but faith that you're with us and we could put our entire life, our whole being in your capable hands. May we give our hearts to you fully and entirely and completely. You are the one who will see us through. Amen.